The dust storm had been raging across the barren plains of 442B for 3 long days. The wind howled like a wounded animal and threw sand against every surface with enough force to strip paint from metal. Most people stayed inside during these storms. Most people prayed for them to end quickly. But Danny had lived on this forsaken world long enough to know that prayers meant nothing out here on the rim. Danny was a former mining engineer from Earth. He was one of the stubborn few who had stayed behind when the big corporations pulled out and left the colonists to fend for themselves. That was almost 10 years ago now. The water wars had started shortly after, and the criminal gangs had moved in to fill the empty space left by the departed authorities. Life on 442B had become a daily struggle for survival, and Danny had learned to keep his head down and mind his own business. His homestead sat alone in the middle of nowhere. It was a squat building made of reinforced concrete and salvaged metal. It had thick walls designed to withstand the storms and a deep basement where he stored his most precious resource, water. On this world, water was worth more than gold or starship fuel or human life itself. Danny guarded his supply carefully and shared it with no one. That night, everything changed. The pounding on his door came just after midnight. It was desperate and frantic, like someone beating their fists against the metal with the last of their strength. Danny grabbed his plasma rifle and approached carefully. He had learned long ago that opening doors without caution could get a man killed on frontier worlds. He activated the external camera, and what he saw made his heart stop for just a moment. A young woman stood in the howling wind. She was not human. Her skin was lavender and her eyes were large and amber like pools of honey. Danny recognized the species from his time working the trade routes years ago. They were peaceful people known for their skill in commerce and scholarship. They needed twice as much water as humans to survive, which made them easy targets in places like this. The woman was holding something against her chest, a small child wrapped in torn fabric. The little one was barely moving. Danny did not think. He did not calculate the cost or consider the danger. He simply opened the door and pulled them inside. The woman collapsed the moment she crossed the threshold. Danny caught her before she hit the ground and carried her to his small living area. The child in her arms stirred weakly but did not wake. Both of them were in terrible condition. Their lavender skin was cracked and pale from dehydration. Their lips were split and bleeding. They had been wandering in that storm for a long time. Danny moved quickly. He retrieved water from his personal reserves and held the container to the woman's lips. She drank greedily at first and then stopped herself with visible effort. She turned the container toward her child instead. The little girl drank and drank until began returning to her small face. The woman's name was, her daughter was called Myra. She spoke in a weak voice as Danny tended to them, and her story came out in broken pieces between sips of water. They had been traveling with a merchant convoy through the canyon passes to the south. The convoy had been carrying medical supplies to the settlements near the old mining districts. It was supposed to be a safe journey. The route had been scouted. Guards had been hired. Everything had been planned carefully. But the Red Fang had found them anyway. Danny felt his stomach tighten at the mention of that name. The Red Fang was the most feared gang on 442B. They controlled the northern water routes and demanded tribute from every settlement within hundreds of. Their leader was a monster named, a former colonial marine who had turned to banditry after deserting his unit. He was known for his cruelty and his complete lack of mercy. Told Danny how the gang had ambushed the convoy at dawn, how they had killed the guards and rounded up the merchants like cattle. Her husband had tried to fight back. He had grabbed a weapon from a fallen guard and stood between the bandits and his family. They shot him down without hesitation. His voice broke as she described watching him fall, watching the life leave his eyes while she clutched their daughter and screamed. In the chaos that followed, she had somehow escaped. She had grabbed Myra and run into the storm without looking back. She had wandered for 2 days without water or shelter or hope. She had been ready to die when she saw the lights of Danny's homestead in the distance. Danny listened in silence. When she finished, he simply and told her she was safe now. She could stay as long as she needed. Looked at him with confusion in her amber eyes. She did not understand. Water was precious. Shelter was precious. Why would a stranger risk both for aliens he had never met? Danny thought about the question for a long moment. He thought about his grandfather who had fought in the last war on Earth. The old man had sheltered refugees from corporate death squads even when it put his own family in danger. He thought about his father who had been a rescue pilot on Mars. The man had died saving colonists from a reactor meltdown when Danny was just a boy. They did not abandon people in need. It was not in their blood. Danny told to rest. He told her that tomorrow they would figure out what to do next. For now she and her daughter were safe, and that was enough. He watched curl up on his small bed with Myra pressed against her chest. The little girl was breathing easier now. Her small hand clutched a fold of her mother's torn clothing like she was afraid to let go even in sleep. Danny returned to the window and stared out at the raging storm. He knew what he had done. He knew the Red Fang never let their prey escape. They would track footprints. They would find his homestead. They would come for what they believed belonged to them. But Danny had made his choice. He checked his plasma rifle and settled into his chair by the door. The storm would end eventually. The danger would come eventually. But for tonight, a mother and child were sleeping safely in his home. For tonight, that was all that mattered. Danny closed his eyes and waited for the dawn. 3 days passed in something close to peace. The storm finally died down on the second morning and left behind a landscape of orange dust and silence. Danny went about his daily routines while slowly regained her strength. He showed her where everything was kept and explained how the water recycling system worked. He taught her which parts of the homestead were reinforced and which were vulnerable. He wanted her to understand the place in case something happened to him. Little Myra recovered than her mother. Children were resilient that way. By the third day, she was following Danny around the homestead like a small purple shadow. She watched everything he did with those big amber eyes and asked questions in her soft voice. Danny found himself patiently even though he had never been particularly good with children. On the third evening, Danny taught Myra how to play a card game from Old Earth. It was a simple game his grandfather had taught him many years ago. The rules were easy and the little girl picked them up quickly. When she won her first hand, she laughed out loud. It was a bright sound that filled the small homestead like sunlight, watched from across the room with tears in her eyes. It was the first time Myra had laughed since her father's death. Something dormant stirred in Danny's heart that night. He had been alone for so long. He had buried himself in work and isolation and told himself he preferred it that way. But watching Myra shuffle the cards with her small hands made him remember what it felt like to have a purpose beyond mere survival. The peace ended on the fourth morning. Danny was checking his perimeter sensors when he noticed the dust cloud on the horizon. He grabbed his long-range scope and climbed to the roof of the homestead. What he saw made his blood run cold. 6 armored vehicles were approaching from the north. They moved in a tight formation that spoke of military training and discipline. Danny counted at least 20 armed figures among the convoy. At the front rode a massive figure on a modified hover bike. Even from this distance, Danny could see the glowing red light where the man's left eye should have been. Had found them. Danny climbed down and told to take Myra to the basement. His voice was calm, but his hands were shaking slightly as he checked his weapons. He had a plasma rifle and a pistol and maybe 30 rounds of ammunition between them. Against 20 armed killers, it would not be nearly enough. The convoy stopped just beyond rifle range. They made camp there in the open where Danny could see them clearly. It was a deliberate display of confidence. They wanted him to know they were in no hurry. They wanted him to understand that time was on their side. A single figure approached the homestead under a white flag. It was a young man with nervous eyes and gang tattoos covering his neck. He was a messenger sent to deliver terms. Danny met him on the porch with his rifle slung across his shoulder. The messenger spoke quickly. He said the woman and child were property of the Red Fang. They had escaped from a lawful salvage operation and needed to be returned, fetched high prices on the black market slave routes. The gang was willing to be reasonable. Danny had until sundown to surrender them. If he cooperated, he would be allowed to live. If he refused, the gang would burn his homestead to ashes and take them anyway. Danny listened to every word. When the messenger finished, he gave his answer. No. The messenger blinked in surprise. He asked if Danny understood what he was refusing. Did he know who was? Did he know what the Red Fang did to people who them? Danny, he knew. His answer was still no. The messenger laughed nervously and returned to the convoy. Danny watched him go and then went back inside to prepare. Was waiting for him in the main room. She had heard everything through the thin walls. Tears were streaming down her lavender face as she Danny to reconsider. Her life was not worth his death. He had already given them more kindness than they deserved. She could not let him die for strangers. Danny took her hands in his. He told her about his grandfather and the refugees. He told her about his father and the colonists on Mars. He explained that they had a long tradition of standing up for people who could not stand up for themselves. It was not about logic or survival. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be when he looked in the mirror. Asked him what he planned to do against an army. Danny smiled grimly. He had a few ideas. That night, while the Red Fang watched from their camp, Danny began his preparations. He was not just a mining engineer. Before coming to 442B, he had served 2 tours as a combat engineer in the colonial force. He knew how to build things and he knew how to destroy them. He knew how to turn ordinary materials into weapons of war. He started by retrieving the old mining explosives from his storage shed. They were meant for blasting rock, but they would work just as well against vehicles and men. He planted them in careful patterns around the perimeter of his homestead. Anyone who approached without knowing the safe paths would receive a deadly surprise. Helped where she could, had a natural talent for electronics, and she proved skilled at modifying Danny's equipment. Together they his mining drones to serve as reconnaissance units. The small machines could fly out and report enemy positions. With some additional modifications, they could even attack. As dawn approached, Danny sat down at his emergency transmitter. He hesitated for a long moment before activating it. The frequency he was about to use was one he had not touched in years. It was a channel reserved for veterans, a way for former soldiers to reach each other across the vast distances of space. He typed a simple message, coordinates, a time frame, 3 words. Needs backup. He had no idea if anyone would receive it. He had no idea if anyone would care. The rim was vast, and his friends from the old days were scattered across 100 different worlds, but humans had a strange habit of showing up when they were needed most. Danny had seen it happen before. He sent the message and turned off the transmitter. Outside, the sun was rising over the dusty plains. The Red Fang was stirring in their camp. Soon they would test soon the killing would begin. Danny checked his rifle one more time and took his position by the window. He was ready. The 5th day brought the first test. Danny had been expecting it since the moment the Red Fang made camp. Was not a patient man. He would want to probe them before committing his full force. It was basic military strategy and had been a Marine once before he became a monster. They came at dawn, 8 men in 2 armored vehicles approaching from the eastern side of the homestead. They moved fast and kept low like they expected sniper fire. They had done this before. They knew how to assault fortified positions. But they did not know about the mines. The first vehicle hit the buried explosives at full speed. The blast lifted the entire machine into the air and tore it apart in a ball of orange fire. Metal fragments flew in every direction and cut down 3 men who had been following on foot. The second vehicle swerved hard to avoid the wreckage, and down in the soft soil Danny had deliberately loosened around the eastern approach. The men inside scrambled to escape as Danny's modified drones descended from the sky. The small machines had been designed to cut through rock with precision lasers. Against human flesh and light armor, they were devastating. 2 more men fell screaming before the survivors managed to shoot down the drones with panicked bursts of gunfire. Only 3 attackers made it back to the main camp. 2 of them were bleeding badly from shrapnel wounds. The third was missing most of his right hand. Danny watched through his scope as the survivors stumbled into his command tent. He could imagine the report they were giving. 1 man, 1 isolated homestead, and they had lost 5 fighters in a matter of minutes. He allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction, but he knew better than to celebrate. The mines were exhausted now. The drones were destroyed. His outer had done their job, but they were gone. When the next attack came, he would have nothing left but his rifle and his courage. Stood outside his tent and stared at the homestead through a pair of military binoculars. Danny could see the rage in the man's posture. This was supposed to be a simple retrieval, a quick job to recover escaped property and make an example of anyone foolish enough to help them. Instead, his men were dying and his reputation was being damaged with every passing hour. The Red Fang controlled through fear. They survived because everyone on 442B knew that defying them meant death. But if word spread that 1 man could hold them off, then others might start getting ideas. Other settlements might start fighting back. The whole system that kept in power could begin to crumble. Danny understood this. He understood that could not afford to retreat now even if he wanted to. Too much was at stake. The gang leader would throw everything he had at the homestead just to prove a point. That night Danny explained the situation too. He was honest with her because she deserved to know the truth. His outer were gone. Help might never come. When attacked again, they would probably be overwhelmed. Listened quietly. When Danny finished, she did not cry. She did not beg him to run. She simply asked him to teach her how to shoot. Danny stared at her for a long moment. Were not warriors. Their culture valued peace and trade and scholarly pursuits. Violence was alien to them in ways most humans could not understand, for to ask for a weapon meant she had accepted what was coming. He handed her a pistol and showed her how to hold it. Her hands trembled at first, but she forced them steady through sheer will. He taught her how to aim and how to squeeze the trigger gently. He taught her to always look for cover and never to stand in one place for too long during a firefight. She was not a natural. Her shots went wide more often than not. But there was determination in her amber eyes that Danny had seen before in the faces of soldiers. She would fight for her daughter. She would kill if she had to. Meanwhile, little Myra remained hidden in the basement shelter. Danny had made it as comfortable as possible. He had given her blankets and food and a small lamp that cast warm shadows on the walls. He had also made her something special during the quiet hours of the night, a stuffed animal crafted from old fabric scraps. It was crude and lopsided, but Myra clutched it to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Danny told her the stuffed animal was a guardian. He told her it would keep her safe while the grown-ups dealt with the bad people outside. Myra looked at him with those trusting eyes and said she believed him. She said Danny was brave like her father had been. The words hit Danny harder than any bullet could have. He had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. On the sixth day sent a new message. No more negotiations, no more mercy. The attack would come at midnight. Every man in the gang would participate. There would be no prisoners and no survivors. Danny received the message and said nothing in return. There was nothing left to say. As the sun set, he took one last walk around his homestead. He checked every weapon and every defensive position. He made sure Myra was secure in her shelter. He told where to stand and when to shoot and where to run if things went badly. Then he climbed to the roof and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there his message was traveling through the void. Somewhere out there old friends might be hearing his call. But space was vast and time was short, and Danny knew he could not count on rescue. He climbed down and took his position by the main entrance. The moon was rising over the eastern hills. In a few hours the Red Fang would come. In a few hours he would find out what he was truly made of. Danny checked his rifle one final time and waited for midnight. The attack came exactly at midnight. Danny heard the engines first, a low rumble that grew into a roar as all 6 vehicles of the Red Fang convoy surged forward across the dusty plain. Headlights cut through the darkness like angry eyes and tracer fire lit up the sky as the gang laid down suppressing shots. Danny counted the attackers through his scope. 18 men remained after the losses from the first assault. They were spread across the vehicles with weapons bristling from every surface. At the center of the formation rode on his hover bike. The gang leader's cybernetic eye glowed red in the darkness like a demon from old Earth stories. This was no longer about recovering escaped property. Danny could see that clearly now. This was about pride and power and sending a message to everyone on 442B. Would burn this homestead to the ground even if it cost him half his men. The first vehicle reached the outer perimeter and Danny opened fire. His shot caught the driver through the windshield and the vehicle swerved wildly before crashing into a pile of salvage metal. Men spilled out of the wreck and scrambled for cover as Danny shifted his aim and dropped 2 more. But there were too many of them. They kept coming from every direction. Fired from her position by the eastern window. Her shots were wild and most went wide, but she forced several attackers to duck and find cover. It bought Danny precious seconds to reload and reposition. The water tower trap claimed its victims when the second wave of attackers triggered the hidden charges. The explosion ruptured the main tank and sent a cascade of water and mud across the southern approach. 4 men were caught in the flood and swept off their feet. The precious liquid soaked into the thirsty ground within seconds, but the damage was done. The southern assault stalled completely. Danny felt a sharp pain in his left shoulder as a bullet found its mark. The impact spun him halfway around and he tasted blood in his mouth, but he forced himself to keep moving. He kept firing. He kept fighting. The main entrance gave way under sustained fire. 3 attackers burst through the splintered door and Danny met them with his pistol at close range. 2 went down immediately, but the third tackled him to the ground. They struggled in the darkness as fists and elbows flew. Danny finally managed to get his knife free and ended the fight with a single thrust. He staggered to his feet covered in blood that was not entirely his own. His shoulders screamed with pain, but he ignored it. There was no time for weakness. Cried out and Danny turned to see her clutching her arm where a bullet had grazed the flesh. The wound was not serious, but she had dropped her pistol in shock. Danny shouted for her to get to the basement with Myra, to barricade the door and not come out no matter what she heard. She hesitated for just a moment, then she ran. Danny was alone now, alone against an army. He fell back to his final defensive position, a reinforced corner of the main room where he could cover both entrances with limited ammunition. His rifle was empty. His pistol had maybe 6 rounds left. Blood was dripping down his arm and his vision was starting to blur at the edges. Through the shattered windows he could see dismounting from his hover bike. The gang leader was striding toward the homestead with his weapon raised. He was done waiting. He was coming to finish this personally. Danny raised his pistol and prepared to make his last stand. And then the sky exploded with light. 3 ships descended through the smoke-filled clouds. They came fast and hard with their hulls glowing from the heat of rapid atmospheric entry. They were old vessels, civilian transports modified with weapons and armor, but their insignias told Danny everything he needed to know. The veterans had answered his call. The ships touched down in a triangle formation around the homestead. Ramps dropped and men and women came pouring out with weapons blazing. There were 27 of them, miners and farmers and merchants now but soldiers once. They had come from 6 different worlds and they had traveled for days without rest. The Red Fang fighters found themselves caught between Danny's fortifications and the unexpected reinforcements. They were outnumbered now. The hunters had become the hunted in the span of seconds. Most of them broke and ran. They fled into the darkness with the veterans. Shots rang out across the plain as the cowards were cut down one by one. Only refused to flee. He stood in the middle of the burning courtyard with his weapon raised and his cybernetic eye blazing with fury. His men were dying around him, but he would not retreat. His pride would not allow it. Danny emerged from the homestead and faced him across the flames. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, saw the blood on Danny's clothes and the exhaustion in his eyes. He saw a man who should have been broken and was still standing anyway. For just a moment, something like respect flickered in his remaining organic eye. Then he raised his weapon to fire. A plasma bolt caught him in the chest before he could pull the trigger. The gang leader looked down at the smoking hole in his body with an expression of pure surprise. Then he fell forward and did not move again. Danny turned to see who had fired the killing shot. An old woman with grey hair and steel eyes was lowering her rifle. She wore the insignia of a colonial marine veteran on her worn jacket. Her face was weathered by years, but her aim had been perfect. Her name was Grace, Danny's aunt, a veteran of 3 colonial wars who had retired to a farming moon on the Outer Rim decades ago. She crossed the burning courtyard and pulled Danny into a fierce embrace. She told him she had come as fast as she could. She told him the family always came first. That was the way. Danny held onto her and let himself feel safe for the first time in days. The battle was over. The Red Fang was destroyed. Against all odds, he had survived. Behind him, he heard a small voice calling his name. He turned to see Myra running across the courtyard with close behind. The little girl threw herself into his arms and buried her face against his chest. She was crying and laughing at the same time. Danny held her close and looked up at the stars. Help had come, humanity had come, just like he always knew they would. The months that followed the battle brought changes that no one could have predicted. The destruction of the Red Fang left a power vacuum across the northern territories of 442b. Other gangs circled like vultures hopping to claim the abandoned water routes and tribute networks, but they found something unexpected waiting for them. The veterans who had answered Danny's call decided to stay. It started with just a handful of them. Grace remained to help her nephew rebuild his shattered homestead. A former medic named Carl stayed to treat the wounded. A pilot named stayed because she had nowhere else to go. One by one, they made the choice to put down roots on this harsh world. Word spread quickly across the rim, a place where veterans looked out for each other, a place where the strong protected the weak instead of preying on them. Within weeks, more ships began arriving. Former soldiers brought their families and their skills and their dreams of building something better. The small homestead became a village and the village became a settlement. They called its Ridge after the man who had started it all. And Myra stayed, of course. Danny would not have had it any other way. The woman proved herself invaluable to the growing community. Her technical skills helped improve everything from water recycling systems to communication networks. She taught the settlers how to build more efficient power cells and how to repair equipment that humans had long considered beyond saving. Myra grew up surrounded by people who loved her. She learned to speak 3 languages and could fix a broken engine before she was 10 years old. The other children in the settlement treated her as one of their own. Her lavender skin and amber eyes were simply part of who she was. Nobody cared that she was different. The settlement established trade routes with other communities across the planet. They shared water and food and protection. When bandits threatened a neighboring town, the veterans of Sridge rode out to help. When disease struck a distant mining camp, they sent medicine and doctors. Slowly but surely, the culture of the planet began to change. Fear gave way to cooperation. Isolation gave way to community. 3 years after the battle, Danny and were married in a small ceremony on the ridge overlooking the settlement. Grace officiated because she had been ordained as a ship's chaplain during her military days. Myra served as the flower girl, and through petals she had grown herself in the community greenhouse. That night, as the celebration continued around them, Danny and stood together under the stars. She asked him if he ever regretted opening his door that night during the storm, if he ever wished he had just stayed hidden and safe. Danny thought about the question for a long time. He thought about the fear he had felt when he saw the Red Fang convoy approaching. He thought about the pain of his wounds and the terror of the final battle. He thought about how close he had come to dying alone in the darkness. Then he looked at the settlement full of people who had found hope in this harsh place. He looked at Myra dancing with the other children around a bonfire. He told he would do it all again in a heartbeat. 2 years later, historians from Earth came to document the settlement that had transformed an entire planet. They interviewed dozens of people and recorded hundreds of hours of testimony. Everyone had stories to tell about the early days and the battles that followed and the slow work of building a civilization from nothing. But they all wanted to know the same thing. Why had Danny risked everything for strangers? Why had one man stood against impossible odds for people who were not even his own species? Danny sat on his porch with his arm around as he considered how to answer. Their first child together was growing in her womb now, a hybrid who would carry both their people's heritage into the future. Myra sat at his feet playing cards with Grace, who had become a grandmother in every way that mattered. He told the historians about his grandfather and the refugees. He told them about his father and the colonists on Mars. He told them about Grace crossing the stars to stand beside him when he needed her most. He explained that humanity had a long tradition of protecting those who could not protect themselves. It was in their blood, it was in their bones. But it was more than that. He told them that when he opened his door that night and saw Myra standing in the storm, he did not see aliens. He saw a mother trying to save her child. He saw courage and desperation and hope. He saw the same things that had driven humanity to cross the stars in the first place. He said that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their weapons. It was their capacity to look at the stranger and see family, to find the orphan and build a home, to stand against the darkness and refuse to yield. That was why humans mattered. That was why across 1,000 worlds the name of humanity had become synonymous with hope. The historians wrote down every word. They did not know it yet, but this story would become one of the most famous accounts in galactic history. It would be taught in schools and told around campfires on 100 different worlds. Children of every species would grow up hearing about the human who sheltered a thirsty alien girl and her child from bandits and then stood alone against an army. They would call it the Standards Ridge. But for Danny, sitting on his porch with his family around him, it was not a legend or a historical event. It was simply home. It was simply the life he had built by doing what he knew was right. The sun was setting over the ridge and painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in the settlement, children were laughing. Somewhere a veteran was telling stories of the old days. Somewhere new ships were landing, bringing more people who had heard about this place and wanted to be part of something good. Danny held close and watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. He had never expected any of this. He had never asked to be a hero or a founder or a symbol of anything. He had just opened a door during a storm and let a stranger in from the cold. But sometimes that was all it took. Sometimes one small act of kindness could change everything. Danny smiled and kissed his wife's forehead. Myra climbed into his lap and asked him to tell her a story. Grace started dealing another hand of cards. The universe was vast and cold and full of dangers. But here on this small ridge on a distant world, a family had found each other, a community had found purpose, a planet had found hope. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.